This ultimately cuts to the core of periodization and answers the question of how and why we train today in order to get the best result. In 1988, Bill Kazmaier set the all-time log press world record with a 375. The big disruption in terms of overhead strength didn't come until Zydrunas came on the scene. Before he was known as the most dominant strongman of all time, he made his name by setting and then re-breaking his own records for the better part of 15 years. In 2008, he set a 440-pound log press at the Log Lift World Championships. In 2015, he demonstrated one of what is arguably the most impressive strength feats of all time with a 502-pound log press. Now, while Zydrunas stands apart as one of the greatest ever, log presses over 400 pounds have become routine in the sport, being demonstrated not just by other heavyweight pros, but by middleweights and often amateurs. And these lifts are often being set by people who obviously aren't even close to Bill Kazmaier's physicality. So this begs the question, how did that record stand for so long, and what allowed it to be broken in such dramatic fashion? Now, the answer to this, of course, is specialization, which many people just confuse for getting good at something. Now, the key context of specialization is that you're actually getting good at something at the expense of other things. It's common for people to get overeager when they're setting their training goals and want to specialize in all things. The main idea is that time, energy, focus, and resources are limited. And the more you spread those resources across other goals, the less you really have to dedicate to that one specialized goal. Specialization is the difference between a decathlete training to improve his shot put distance and the training of somebody who lives and dies to break the shot put world record at the Olympic Games. One has to balance that training with 9 other events, many of which conflict and work against that primary goal, while the other is able to dedicate all of their calories, energy, and resources to the execution of that one particular thing. In sports, specialization means training specifically for game time demand. Strongman started out as a sport that was distinctly anti-specialization. In the 1970s, when the sport started, athletes came from all different backgrounds. They pulled from powerlifters, weightlifters, even wrestlers to try and find who was the strongest man alive. And the way that they did it was by having them run through this varied gauntlet of different exercises. And none of them really knew what was going on and were certainly not prepared for any of the events that they were being tested in. Now, that was ultimately part of the draw. It had the same type of be ready for anything feel that CrossFit became known for decades later. Now, certainly anybody who could show up and take the W from that field of absolute units was a specimen to behold. And the champions of the day gave a hint as to what kind of athletes would be favored in the future of strongman as it evolved. Successful strongman had to be tall, they had to be muscular, they had to have capacity, coordination, athleticism, explosiveness, adaptability, and yes, they had to be strong. But the thing is, not one of those particular traits was so valuable that it should be optimized at the expense of any of the others. Now, Kaz was a perfect example of that. He had an athletic background. For as big and as strong as he wasn't like a rusted out human forklift. He was able to move. He was extremely explosive and aggressive, and he had staying power. The fact that he was so much stronger than everybody else while also being athletic and adaptable made him a perfect example of an early strongman prototype. But there was still something missing from his performance, and it's only through the hindsight of history that we can really see what that was. As the sport grew, athletes realized that they could get a monstrous advantage by drilling the actual events they could expect to see in competition. Where one might have initially thought that a monster powerlifting total was the primary prerequisite for dominating at World's Strongest Man, it quickly became apparent that staple events like super yokes, farmers walks, stone loads, and yes, the log press could benefit hugely, even in the strongest and most athletic competitors, if they actually took the time to drill them specifically. So over here we have an S curve. This is an example of a learning curve, and it shows what happens as time is spent getting a handle on a particular skill. And over time, you see an exponential growth. That's when you really start to get a purchase on what it is that you're doing. And then it eventually levels out over time. And this represents kind of a global learning that happens when multiple athletes that populate the sport are able to figure out some key component of the sport that they're actually competing in. So you see this 375 is hit by Bill Kazmaier in 1988, and that's only a little over a decade after the inception of the sport of strongman. And in this time, you see an exponential curve in actual pressing ability as we get into the 2000s, where 400 plus pound logs became more regular and mainstream. And then eventually where Zydrunas dominated between 2008 and 2015, moving the record all the way up to 502 pounds. Now it's important to note, Zydrunas and Kazmaier had very similar pressing abilities. Kazmaier was rumored to have been able to strict overhead press between 450 and 500 pounds, which is plausible considering he was a mid 600 pound bench presser and one of the strongest men in the world at the time. Zydrunas doesn't use a specific or a very technical technique to get the weight overhead. He uses a push press with very shallow leg drive and actually strict presses a lot of his attempts when he's able to. It seems to be the difference in this gap is actually a byproduct of more specific touches on the implement and basing your training around it. As learning starts to accelerate, it eventually levels out. And this represents a period in time where we have the most amount of talent and the greatest amount of access to good training resources. As things level out, we're starting to reach this upper limit of human achievement, and that's shown by Iron Bibby's 504, which since 2015 is the heaviest log press ever done. He only ticked Zydrunas' record forward by 2 pounds. Now, there's no doubt about it, this strength is the primary quality that supports success in such a sport. But without specialization, without prioritizing the particular thing that you are trying to get good at and dominate, you are never going to perform as well as you could have. Now, there are plenty of fields that are analogous to strongman that have gone through the same type of evolution. Sports like CrossFit and mixed martial arts originated with athletes who had achieved some amount of excellence in other sports and were transitioning over into this field that was much more varied and seemingly randomized. In mixed martial arts, it took time before people realized how to arrange their training to optimize all of the skills they would need in order to put together a fully competitive package. And it was only through specializing in mixed martial arts over any one of the smaller disciplines that people used to train in before that people actually started to be able to get competitive and get that edge. And what happens when that occurs is that the sport itself becomes much more competitive because you have more people who are optimizing more facets of performance. And the result is that there's ultimately less margin for error. It becomes much more difficult to compete at the top. Now, that also has very big implications for your training. You have to be very concrete with your goals and know if your primary goal is to be the best at a particular event or to be the best at the competition overall. Many people are complacent with being the best presser or deadlifter around. And if that's ultimately the goal that drives you, that's fine. That means that you can take more resources and funnel them towards that one specific end. But if that lift is just one piece of a bigger puzzle and the primary goal is to actually dominate this multivariate sport, your approach has to be different. And specializing in that sport is going to be very different than specializing in one individual lift. I want to give a special shout out to my supporters on Patreon and in the YouTube channel memberships. I just started doing a podcast. I'm only 6 episodes in. I film those and put those up on the Patreon, and I give them to the YouTube members before they get released to the general public on Spotify, Apple, and Google Podcasts. It's also a very robust network of people who contribute by talking to each other, asking questions, giving me ideas for content. So to anybody that wants to help support the channel or wants further engagement with me, please consider stopping by and supporting my channel because that is what allows me to make content like this. That's really the key with specialization, is understanding if the goal that you have, the thing that you're trying to get good at, is that the end or is it the means to some other end? Take a deadlift, for example. You might be dedicated to increasing your pull, but you have to understand why you're doing it. Is it for health reasons? Is it to make you better at some other sport? Or is it because your bucket list is really just to have a really big deadlift before you die and you don't care a lot about anything else? If really all you're after is like bone density and extra utility in your day-to-day life, you're not going to be as likely to prioritize your training in a way that you'll kill yourself just for an extra 20 pounds on your deadlift. And if your goal is actually to get better at a broader, more varied sport like football or strongman or wrestling, doing that for the pursuit of a little extra strength might actually be counterproductive when it comes to developing a total package. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't do these movements at all or that you don't worry about anything that isn't entirely strength specific. It just means you have to be aware enough so that you can mitigate the recovery effects of trying to do all of these different things at once. Even if you are trying to be a powerlifter or a strongman, where increasing your deadlift is very, very important, it still takes a slight back seat to being well-rounded. Having the biggest deadlift at the meet isn't necessarily going to guarantee the win when it comes to the total. In fact, it's very common for guys to have very ridiculous pulls and not be able to squat their way out of a paper bag. In that scenario, rounding yourself out so that all three lifts are more developed is going to guarantee more consistently high placings. So this is why it's incredibly important to be very real with yourself when it comes to exactly what your goals are. Now, over your entire training lifetime, regardless of what your goal is, the degree in which you're going to specialize towards that end is going to change dramatically. Over-specialization too early is a very big problem, both in general athletics and strength sports. And the most common pitfall that people fall into is trying to find what their favorite lifter or athlete does and just mimic that. That ignores the fact that those athletes are the best performers and that they train the way now because of the way they trained early on. I can't emphasize this point enough. What the best performers do is not what you should be doing. Green athletes and lifters lack a basic amount of muscle mass, strength, and coordination. Whatever program you jump into, those are going to be the limiting factors, and you're not going to be able to train for a completely peaked out, well-rounded package until you address those smaller issues. When you jump into a program that was written for the best performers, the people that already paid their dues, you're going to be missing the basic developmental process that those lifters and athletes have already gone through. And you're going to delay progress and development that otherwise would have been really dramatic. There are a lot of triggers for growth. And when you're new, using simple things like isolation movements, varied exercise, AMRAPs, sets to failure, those are extremely good at developing young and new lifters, even if they don't tend to represent the most strength-specific approach to advanced athletes. Newer lifters improve the fastest when they address those issues first, not when they jump into the most specialized program that they saw on Instagram that relies on the same three basic lifts for exclusively singles, doubles, and triples. Let's take a look at Boris Shiko's novice routine. This is a man who came out of the Soviet system into great success with Olympic lifting and powerlifting. He came from the system that we all still cite today. And it wasn't like the Soviet system was just oriented towards strength or Olympic lifting. They had an entire system based around Olympic development. And all of the sports in it, including Olympic lifting, were treated as an individual piece of this bigger puzzle. So it was more like the pursuit of like a grand unified theory of sport, as opposed to just trying to figure out how do we get people the strongest. So a lot of the principles that you see in Olympic lifting, they get transferred to powerlifting in a lot of the Soviet models. They have a lot of basic sport principles in them, more so than what you might find in more Western approaches. So as you can see, Shiko's program, it uses a ton of variety. He's having these novice lifters do a lot of body weight exercises. There's lunges and push-ups. There's dumbbell work. There's isolation work. You can see how varied, almost jumbled the program is. The only threat here is that they're doing a lot of different things and training at a lot of different thresholds. That's very important to point out. This is anti-specialization. And this is what we see in general youth athletics. It repeats this principle. As new athletes are exposed to a variety of movements, especially in a play setting, it triggers an association that's positive when it comes to training and competition. It's really only after that they pass this like driver's ed for their body that they develop this baseline of strength, ability, and coordination that they're even justified in trying to look at programs that are more specific and more specialized. So parents of athletes, remember that you're not better off giving your 6-year-old a baseball bat and making them swing it for 2 hours if you're trying to get them to break the home run record in 2040. Now, on the other hand, when that base has been built and you actually have these really high, lofty, competitive goals on the horizon, that's a point where specialization really has to be the highest. And that brings us to this point that specialization is also going to change within an entire training program. So the long term is that novices have to do more varied stuff, build that wider base before they become developed enough to be able to justify the more specialized work. As lifters start to get into periodized programs in the short term, 12 weeks, 16 weeks, they're actually going to change specialization within the context of that limited training time. So just like CrossFit, Strongman, and MMA eventually required athletes to specialize in those arrangements of activities if they wanted to be competitive. You also have to specialize if you want to be competitive in whatever your chosen field is. Now here's the rub. While you definitely need to specialize, you can't do it too much. Now we've already talked about newbies, what happens when younger undeveloped lifters put the cart before the horse and try to train for those specialized qualities before they've built a base that can sustain it in the first place. But even think about that in broader terms. What would happen if football players only played football? What would happen if powerlifters only ran through a powerlifting meet for their actual training stress? We have to understand that there is a lot of development to be had that can benefit your total performance that isn't going to be the most specific thing in the world. So the question becomes, how do we arrange that? That might be daunting at first glance, but it's actually pretty straightforward. You just have to understand a few principles. And when you do, that's really going to cut to the core of a lot of periodization principles that get enacted at all times. They're seen everywhere, but they're not really talked about or discussed very often. If you follow anything I've put out, you already know that you have to change stress over time or else diminished returns set in. So in that way, we already block off training through different periods that go through an ebb and flow of stress. It might be high rep to low rep. It might be high volume to low volume. It might change the types of exercises that you do. If we're preparing specifically for a competition, it makes sense to arrange those blocks in a way where what you're doing right now is made better because of what you did before, and that's called potentiation. Now, when we add a skill element to it, it makes sense to put all of your broad and varied skill development, the things that are less like the competition, further away and save the most specific things, the very narrow band of exercises that are most like what you're going to do in the game scenario, closer to the meet. So if we start with a basic prep that starts 16 weeks out, in the beginning, you're going to start out with a lot of variation for a lot of work that's going to build up a lot of fatigue, and you're going to do it across a wide variety of reps. So the things that are going to prop you up for a big deadlift that are less specific, it might be variations of the deadlift. It might be lower body exercises that look different but work the same muscles that are involved in a deadlift. There's going to be isolation stuff, machines, dumbbells, body weight. There are a whole host of exercises that you can incorporate that in some roundabout way are going to round you out, make you symmetrical, eliminate weaknesses, and ultimately improve efficiency for down the road when you go for that one big bucket list deadlift attempt. As you get closer to the meet, you're going to incorporate more work with the main lift, and you might limit the variations you do to the ones that are more specific. One thing I like to focus on with my lifts is to do the more disadvantaged stuff earlier out. Those are things like RDLs, front squats, close grip benching. Those are things where you're disadvantaged, so the weight has to be lower. Those movements are very good for rounding out your lifts and especially for adding muscle mass. But if the name of the game is at week 0, hitting the biggest attempt you can, load is a very specific factor. So you want to keep the movements that keep the load down further away. You want to prioritize closer to the contest date movements that allow heavier loads to be used. That's why things like banded work and block pulls and elevated lifts that work through shorter ranges of motion are generally considered more specific. Even if they don't look exactly like the main lift or they limit the range of motion, the fact that the nervous system is being targeted in order to recruit as many motor units as possible is a very specific quality. So that's one of the things I like to include. So as we get into this like 6-week, 4-week mark, we're really down to the main lift and a couple of key variations, like the heavy ones I just mentioned, and a minimal amount of targeted accessory that you think is relevant to whatever lift or events you're getting used to. Down to 2 weeks out, you've cut out pretty much all the fluff. Now the benefit is that recovery is going to be very, very high because you're not doing all of this stuff. It's very focused, again, narrow and specific, which means all you have to do is hit a token amount of work over a couple exercises that look like contest day, and you're going to see this big upswing in performance as your body is now allowed to recover so that optimal strength can actually be expressed, which it really can't early on when you're dealing with all this fatigue. Now, if we take the lens out more, maybe you're not specializing in one movement. Maybe you're specializing in an entire competition. If you're a strongman, deadlifting is extremely important to general performance and it's very often tested. But if you have the biggest event of the year and there's no deadlift in it, it doesn't make a ton of sense to break yourself. So in that instance, you have to switch how the specialization occurs. So you might be doing deadlifts early on to drive performance, and you might be trying to increase strength there to help all your other stuff, but that's using the deadlift to help potentiate the things that are more specific to your contest. So if your event is only an overhead press, some loading, and a couple of carries, well, you better believe 3-4 weeks out, those are the only things you're going to be doing. And any attention you give to other things, whether it's something kind of close like a deadlift, or whether it's something way out there like running a marathon or doing a mud run, those things have to be left by the wayside. So again, you can recover and peak. And in all of these examples, you benefit from the variety, from changing the stimulus and giving your body new reason to adapt, from organizing that change in a way that's focused and has direction, that is, you're potentiating one phase from the one before it, and by arranging skill acquisition in a logical way so that the most specific things happen right before the big day. This ultimately cuts to the core of periodization and answers the question of how and why we train today in order to get the best result. Now, if only Bill Kazmaier could have gone back in time, gotten his hands on a log, and ran through something like this, I don't think anybody has any doubt that he would have been pressing 100 pounds or more than he actually did. But that's the burden of being a groundbreaker. He set those marks so that later generations could come in and break them. So that's all I've got for today, guys. Thanks for watching. Until next time, this is Bromley. I'll see you.